Design Award Maps Possible. They gave us their full support and funding for these. You'll want to look at them. They're in 2 parts. Eventually, these maps, they're in 6 panels, are going to be put on the foam board, and that's how they will look once they are in final form. And they will hang in the association office, probably in the design committee office. That's what they were intended for all of Sea Ranch. We want to thank Linda and Sandy, who have been really helpful throughout this whole process of getting the program together. They were terrific. And thanks to the maintenance crew as well for setting up this room. And I have a particular, Al and I have a particular thanks for Rose Hawker and her crew who set up the wine reception afterwards. They saved my life. I want to introduce Scott Sheffo, who's our volunteer professional photographer. Scott, if you would stand up. Where are you? There. Turn around and say hi. Scott has volunteered hundreds of his professional hours to photographing first for the Condominium 1 National Register nomination, and then taking 80 photographs for Wayne's use in his presentation today. Thanks so much, Scott. You did a terrific job. Finally, we thank Wayne Donaldson. Wayne, do you want to stand up so they know who you are? State Historic Preservation Officer, for sharing his time and thoughts with us today. For those of you who did not meet Wayne at our 40th anniversary celebration, let me introduce him to you. I've known Wayne and his work for some 20 years, and I can happily tell you that I don't think there's a better restoration architect in California. Wayne's design is innovative, and he has rescued many an otherwise hopeless building. Before the governor appointed Wayne State Historic Preservation Officer, Wayne had a successful 26-year practice as a restoration and preservation architect in San Diego. He graduated from Cal Poly with a degree in architecture, and he has a master's in science and an MA in history as well. His list of memberships is long and tongue-tying, but I'm going to give it a try. Wayne is currently a member of the California State Historical Capital Commission, a former vice chair of the State Historical Building Safety Board, a past member of the State Historical Resources Commission, and past president of the California Preservation Foundation. Wayne has received the California Council American Institute of Architects Award of Excellence, the Historic Preservation Award, and the 1996 Preservationist of the Year Award, all from the California Preservation Foundation. And best of all, Wayne is a great and talented human being. He's here today to help us initiate a conversation about Sea Ranch's architectural legacy and talk about the concept, not the actual doing, of a possible nomination of Sea Ranch to the National Register of Historic Places. You're here today to ask questions and get answers. If you don't like the idea, please speak up. Our program is spontaneous, and we hope your questions will be spontaneous as well. We begin with Wayne's slideshow, a discussion of Sea Ranch's impact on the architectural world community in the 1960s. Next, as I said, Wayne will explore the concept of a possible thematic nomination of the Sea Ranch to the National Register of Historic Places. Following Wayne's discussion, we will have what I hope will be a vigorous question and answer session. Al, Boeke, and Wayne welcome all your questions and look forward to answering them. In order that everyone who wishes to speak have time, please limit your questions and remarks to 3 minutes each. Thank you and welcome everyone to a splendid afternoon. Please join us for the wine and cheese reception which follows the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. But thanks for the stay there. Well, this is an amazing turnout. When I was here about a year ago, talking on the 40th year, it was, I think it was sort of a love fest, and this time it may be more controversial, I'm not sure. Anyway, it's a great turnout that we've had here. Scott, you want to pull the cover off? I'm going to go through fairly quickly a number of slides, kind of give you the lay of the land where we're at in nomination of buildings and structures that are from the 1960s. I had a good chance about 2 weeks ago to go back to the National Conference of State Historic Preservation Officers back in Washington, D.C., where all of the other State Historic Preservation officers gathered to talk about common pains, and was asked to give a presentation on problems that we're primarily having in California with the recent past nominations. And I thought I would go through that a little bit and kind of discuss that in detail for you. One of the items, though, I do want to sort of go over and relate to you is more of a historical development of how the Sea Ranch became the Sea Ranch. And I think it's important to see how things have changed over the years and the importance of Sea Ranch as a whole, rather than just Condominium 1, which I think we talked about last time. So I'm going to, hopefully this will work. If not, Scott, you're going to have to bail me out. Okay? Well, let's see here. Try this one. Not that one. Right. Is it coming, or am I screwing the whole thing up here?
You got something on this.
I don't have anything in the computer. Scott, can you do it?
There it is.
Okay. I'll let you do it. Okay. I'll just give you the highlights. All right, being a pilot myself, and I fly an old 1934 Stinson Reliant, and I always get a big kick out of it when I look out, seeing the aileron sort of sticking out there by itself. This sort of reminds me of a story that Boeke told me, is that before he decided to purchase this piece of land as vice president of Oceanic Properties, he flew up and down the coast several times to take a look at it rather than trying to drive it. And of course you can see off to your left the airstrip that's there. But as he was starting off and began this development in 1963, it was known as the Olson Sheep Ranch, and you can see the windrows that were planted there at that time, but notice how sparse the landscaping is. Purchasing 5,000 acres along a 10-mile stretch, about 100 miles north of San Francisco. So Al Boeke organized a team of what I consider probably the first time it's been developed was a wide range of specialists. Besides hiring Larry Halpern, who I've had a chance to work with over the years, he also hired a very young firm of Charles Moore, Don Lindland, William Turnbull, Richard Whittaker. But in addition to that, he also hired Richard Reynolds, who was an ecologic specialist and a geographer, and also Don Carter. But he also hired crazy people like attorneys, hydrologists, climatologists, geologists, public relations, and a marketing firm. And in doing so, they also reached back in time to study the Pomo culture, the Russian settlement, and the local and vernacular architecture. I think this is the first time, if you really read the literature, that this ever happened. Normally it's just a developer, an architect getting together and rising on the land. Next. So as Boeke is a pragmatist, a builder, but first of all he was a persuader, as he set about on a 2-year process of interviews to select the best. And the emphasis from the get-go from this man was on ecology, to preserve the hedgerows, to clean out the forest, and control the metals, not with fire and stuff, but with grazing. So at this time, the Del Mar Ranch morphed into the Sea Ranch. This is now, today, back in June '66, about 10 years ago, aerial showing the development. And you can see now, from the earlier slides, not much really has changed. Flavor's there, and although you see maybe some of the addition of the new hedgerows, it still creates this sense of what Halpern was calling outdoor rooms. And it really became the unparalleled melding of architecture and landscape and ecology all in one. Next. So the first development, and you'll notice there's no hedgerow in front of condo 1 here. You'll notice that the elements that really started this movement was not so much just another piece of architecture on the land, but as Turnbull said, a wooden rock raising from the land. And although Oceanic Properties was interested in selling to individual owners and had several condominiums planned, I think that the whole process then started a new way of thinking that was here. And I remember that Turnbull said at one time, I think Chuck, meaning Charlie Moore, once described the process of 4 people and 1 pencil in search of an idea. This is really unique for architects of the 60s because we're going to visit in the near slide presentation here some 60s architecture that was going on at the same time that the Sea Ranch was going on. Next. Now it's hard to believe this is what the condo 1 looked like after it was built. I think if I was a critic, and some of the critics deemed it as mine shaft revival, or as the editor of the Architectural Forum, which did a very nice article on it called it stick architecture, meaning in my particular vernacular, stick architects were those poor architects that couldn't make it as big architects, instead of having to just do little stick stuff here and there in residential units. So not really a nice term, but the interesting thing is that 2 years after it was built, it captured the AIA National Honor Award. Those types of projects, when I flash back here, are normally not of this scale, certainly not of this vernacular, or of this cost. And it was interesting that they conceived this as a 3D model. They didn't really sit there and sit. They sat around a table with their little sugar cubes, because their sugar cubes, they said, this is a 24 by 24 foot module, and started to stack them up. Obviously, they had to cut and melt down some of the sugar cubes. But it was interesting because they had Louis Kahn as one of their mentors, and Louis Kahn's comment came back to them as muscular structures being pushed by servant spaces. In other words, those spaces you had to have inside as your kitchen and your toilets and stuff were pushed out. And then what was left, it was important to capture the light from above and as reflected off the ocean. So it's interesting, when condo 1 was built then, and although it was up here by itself, it was a 3.5-hour drive by cars. If you remember the muscle cars of the 60s, we didn't have these light little small cars that we have now. The road wasn't in very good condition. But it was interesting because I was reading some of the comments when this was first built, as people started to move up here, and their comments were the beauty, the sea, the remoteness, and the friendly people. The unique ambience, spectacular natural beauty, serenity, large open spaces to be left untouched. And all of a sudden, the knockoffs started to sprout out all over the nation, including in Europe, that this was now the new wave of architecture. And Donaldson has mentioned a couple times, he said, I wish people had paid more attention to the siding than to the siding. Meaning that how these met the land, which was really the important stuff, not that it was made out of what appeared to be weathered barnwood. And then initiated by Joe Zeseret in 1972, the lodge happened. Joe started the design, but it was really Al Boeke who led the design team to finish the project. And at that time, Al wanted this lodge to be a model statement about how it was an attitude towards a public facility that blends with the land, not a cheap, trendy, loud, or garnish with a parking lot out front to sell units. And to me, the lodge is sort of the symbol of the Sea Ranch. This is normally where people will first check in. It's usually where they'll visit. It's where they'll entertain with some of the public members. Although it's been identified as shed architecture, because during the 60s, and one of the things that we have a big problem with, is identification of architecture following the Second War, because in fact, there are no styles. Even when Virginia and Lee McAllister in their Field to American Home had to come up with the word shed. and they give the credit to Shed as identifying Charlie Moore and Robert Venturi. And it's kind of interesting because Robert Venturi didn't do any shed architecture. It was really Condo 1 and the rest of the development that started it. But we'll revisit Robert later. The home sculpture, we're finding that this becomes now a community of artists, free thinkers, craftsmen, entrepreneurs, businessmen, attorneys, which are sort of free thinkers, dancers, actors, architects, musicians, and just plain folk that really want to participate in this particular area. As the experiments in the environment was started, theater and dance became more than just events. It really started then to produce philosophers of character that wanted to live here, or at least visit a couple of weeks, or be identified with it more than anything. Next. So I'd like to visit some of the problems that we're having with this particular period of architecture. This is a glass house purchased by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. It was scheduled to be demolished, if you can imagine. Now, I had a chance to talk to Bill Murtaugh. Bill was the first keeper of the register when it started in 1966 with the National Preservation Act, which also created my position as a State Historic Preservation Officer, mostly dealing with the destruction of the inner city core, where a lot of historic buildings were located, when federal projects would move in. So even though it was really set in my position to deal with federal projects, which we do today, called Section 106 review, it has morphed into more of that over the years. It's interesting that Philip Johnson, when he was alive, there was a nomination by the National Trust to put the glass house on the National Register. But Bill Murtaugh, the first keeper, had two criteria. One is that the property had to be 50 years old, and second of all, if the architect was still living, it would not be nominated. It's not written into the act anywhere, but it's a policy that has maintained itself over the years. And it's kind of interesting is that Johnson and one other person during Bill's reign were the only two nominations to be put on. And I'll revisit that later on. But I think it's interesting talking to him. He never felt that the register, the National Register of Historic Places, would go beyond the Second War. He felt at that time, by the time the buildings are nominated, because remember in 1966 we're talking about buildings that are 1916 or older, which in my neck of the woods in San Diego is the Panama, California Exposition. So it's interesting that they did not contemplate going beyond there. And of course, everything had a style by that time. It was really Frank Lloyd Wright that said, I want to create an American style. Next. So the VDL House in Silver Lake by Richard Neutra. What you see here is the rebuild 1966 after the disastrous fire in 1931. As Richard Neutra was experimenting with materials, so was in 1966. Richard and Dion had to move to Austria, his primary home, because he was told to shut up that Dion Neutra, then his son, supervised the reconstruction. It's interesting that as the reconstruction was going on, now of course Richard has passed on, but Dion is alive, 72 years young, still practicing architecture. Next one. But because now he's still alive, they said, well, since he's still practicing architecture and he had such a major element to do in this house, that we're not going to submit this to the National Register. This house was listed by the Getty Conservation as being one of the most 20th endangered pieces of architecture in the world. It's also been identified by UNESCO as being identified primarily with Richard Neutra and his survival for design. And yet we couldn't get it on the register. It's also rather interesting that Dion, even though he said he did most of the design himself, which in fact he did to the letters because he had a real problem with Dad being overseas, and when Dad came back he changed a lot of Richard's designs that he told him to do through the mail. And of course the mail used to move pretty slow back then. Next. This is Sam Malouf's house in San Bernardino, built in 1949. For you that perhaps haven't heard of Sam Malouf, next. He is a designer of furniture extraordinaire. He has pieces in the Smithsonian, New York Met, the LA County of Art Museum, Boston Museum of Fine Arts. It's kind of an interesting story. This happens to be similar to Kennedy's rocking chair. That's where he had a lot of his things. But Jimmy Carter also purchased a lot of materials. Ray Charles had a chance to visit Sam Malouf once as he was taking him through, and Ray was feeling all the furniture and stuff. And then when he went to a reception by Jimmy Carter, he sat in a chair and he was feeling, he says, "I know this man. This is Sam." So here's Sam now, 90 years old, next. But because he's still alive, and he still works in his studio, is that they will not put this on the nomination. Now, I don't know how much I'm going to do after I turn 90. Probably not too much, except just get around. I don't think you have to prove that this guy is significant in folk art in America. Next. An area I had a chance to work at in 1964 before going overseas, Smith & Williams Complex, 1414 South Fair Oaks in Pasadena. A lot of architects have been through here with Whit Smith and Wayne Williams. It is now scheduled to be demolished. There was a group of people that decided to nominate it. The unique thing like that this one built in 1962, about the same time that Al Boeke flew over this land. And we started the design here, is that it was the first attempt at another collaboration where people have worked together on designs over the years and decided to get together and stay at one place. It included Ekbo, Dean, Austin, Williams, who have now grown to a mega firm called Edol. John Cariotis and Kessler. John Cariotis wrote the books on seismic retrofits of unreinforced masonry buildings. And a person I worked for, Simon Eisner, who with Aaron Gallup were city planners, doing and writing a book called The Urban Pattern. As the nomination came in, everybody thought that both Whit Smith and Wayne Williams were dead because all of their work has now been put. David Gebhardt, when he was alive, got a hold of that, and at the university at California at Santa Barbara has now all of their files on hand. But we found that Wayne Williams, in fact, was alive. So, based on the policy now, even though they have not practiced any more architecture, that they decided not to do it. Next one. This one is amazing. This is the Salk Institute in La Jolla. Also 1965, the same year as we have as the Sea Ranch, by Louis Kahn in collaboration with Jonas Salk. In 1992, at the Chicago AIA National Meeting, there was going to be the addition of 2 small labs that was going to displace a small area of eucalyptus groves. And the way that you approach this is you park your car, very similar, although not in scale, that you have at the lodge, and you get out of your car, and then there's meandering pathways through this eucalyptus grove until you come out and come up the steps to this wonderful plaza looking out at the Pacific Ocean. Big outcry. Again, Louis Kahn has passed away, so has Jonas Salk. But the thing has not reached 50-year-old significance. So we're wondering now, why was this denied? It was denied pretty much because the new owners of the Salk Institute now, on the mesas that you have coming out, is they want to create a very large 4- and 5-story complex that will go out in the mesa, and this whole view will be destroyed. Next one. However, some communities, like San Juan Capistrano, for instance, because on our own local register, or state register, we don't have the 50-year thing, and we don't care about whether the architect's alive. And that's pretty much, with the rest of the states, we found out of the 46 states that were there, 37 of them had that criteria because they believe that these buildings from the recent past are important. So even though this was built in 2000, and I think Michael Graves should do small stuff, because he's pretty good at that. When he gets to do big stuff, I'm not sure about that. And of course, we all saw him over the Olympic Games because he was advertising his stuff for Target, shall we say, including the doghouse. But the interesting thing is that this was placed on the local Register of Historic Resources when it was only 2 years old, because they felt that they had the work of an artist, not just an architect in another building. Again, it's their own city library, but they wanted to look at it. So let's come back to the Sea Ranch, Condo 1. And Louis Kahn, I think is important, and this sort of sets the parameter for my meeting here. It said, look at the past for lessons, not the specifics. In other words, he's not afraid of looking back, but he says it's the principle of creative forgetfulness. So he's saying now, look at the principles, not necessarily the architecture, not necessarily the area that is now perhaps overgrown, but it's kind of interesting because it was really the opposite direction of most of the postmodern approach at this time, where they were looting architectural history for recognizable quotations. In other words, it was a drift back to try to find architecture that you can sort of put the spin on. The demonstration houses by Joseph Esserich were not to be coordinated, in other words, not all the same, to keep each response to the environment in order to avoid some sort of contrived style. And as much as everybody tried to do that, these models then were picked up and pretty much duplicated. And it sort of developed into a narrow sense of function based upon the deflection, the views, and the openness. So as these demonstration houses or head rolls houses, and you notice you can't see too many of them today, it was interesting that progressive architecture, when they gave the award on, I think, 7 or 8 of these units, you got the local Sea Ranch Award, you got the AIA Home Award. Progressive architecture said, and this is kind of comical, the Esserich houses are just conventional enough to deceive the suburban housewife. Today, these houses pretty much retain most of their integrity. The hedgerow was planted in 1916. So even though the hedgerow was pretty much only 50 years old, it kind of reminds me of a lot of the other clusters that you see, because these are sense of places that we normally go to. And I'm sure that in your travels, you've been to Italian village clusters, like I went to in Caripo, which is really in southern Switzerland, the farm villages of Norway, fishing villages off of Osaka, Japan, or just huddles and clusters of small homes along the eastern seaboard. So the vision here by Boeke was, let's see if we can fit 2,000 families on 5,000 acres. Before, a lot of the planning, they said, we're not going to have any house on less than 5 acres. But then all of a sudden, the stewardship of the land became more important than the buildings themselves on each of the lots. Next. Let's go next. I missed you one. I'm sorry, Scott. However, there was also a vision that this is a community, not just for people that are going to come up out of the Bay Area now and then on a weekend, but that it would develop into a community. So the Moonraker Athletic Club was, that was the original name of it. We'll just call it the pool for now. And Charlie Moore and Bill Turnbull, along with Larry Halpern, decided to try to fuse this landscaping building form. And it became quite evident that not only was these recreation units added, but also golf courses, places to put horses and other things. And I really liked the golf course because I had a chance to play at St. Andrews. In fact, that was actually my very first game of golf, so I have a great story to tell, but I'm not going to bore you today. But playing that, bunkers were like small mountains. It was whipped by the North Sea. It was windy, seagrass, and very challenging. And I think this golf course sort of captures that. Baker Barn in 1972. A few months before Bill Turnbull died of cancer, he noted, the older I get, the more I think architecture should be like mashed potatoes and not like ice cream sundaes. Now I think this comes from his bohemian idol, Bernard Maybeck, who made no attention to details because he felt that the living environment and the quality to be in a structure would outweigh all of the cuteness of it. Barnacle Barn, again by Bill Turnbull in 1972. He felt that the jointry would be so simple and so logical that it appears only common sense and not eye-catching elaborations. We hope that you, the observer, are unaware of the details. I really believe, next one, this is it today, along with 1996 editions, which again goes back to Kahn's delivery that look at it for what it relates to you, add the additions that you need, and don't be afraid of it. Next. There were the clusters, 1974, which really promoted, of course, we heard it a million times, of living lightly on the land and merged in. I think it's interesting that these clusters were designed not only just by Turnbull, but later on by Oceanics' own architectural staff, led by Al Boeke. And Al referred these things as changing rooms. In other words, you came with your suit and tie and then you came changed into jeans and boots, which is really the basic Sea Ranch idea. Even though concepts you see in Fort Ross, interpreted in a modern ecological matrix, is that the ecosystem then becomes the dominant force, not the designer, and not necessarily the inhabitor. The problem with most communities that try to do this is that the designers simply don't know when to put the pencil down. Also integrated within the woods, early one from 74, the Bradley Scott House in 1974, one of the earlier Sea Ranch awards, and the Bradley Scott home 2006. It's interesting, people that I bring up here are sort of anti-wood, anti-rot, and everybody thinks that, oh my God, I'm going to go in these houses and I'm going to come out with a sickness and growth on my body and stuff. And they just don't get it. It's just that simple. Next. The Sea Ranch Chapel, I had the honor to put on a show for James Hubble, 1963 at Cal Poly. Along with that was Tim Bruce Richards and Ken Kellogg, which were doing work back in the 60s that looked at this style. Now, even though James has become an international artist, he does everything. He's a sculptor, he's a poet, and he can only think in 3 dimensions. He doesn't do drawings, he lets somebody else do that, he lets somebody else do the structure, and when he's not happy with the structure, he over-designs it. But it's kind of interesting because he can't think in linear capacities that most of us as architects can think. He can only think in 3 dimensions. And he thinks as people, not just as their face, but the back of their heads and the back of their ears are just as important to him because, like you folks sitting today, you'll sit there for the next hour and look at the person's ears and heads. But I think this little structure, and hopefully you've all had a chance to go inside, really reflects the spirit of the Sea Ranch. It's firmly anchored to the ground, like the trees around it. It floats like a pine needle as it dances across the meadows. It's being blown by the wind. And it isn't cute because of its little spring growth of green iron coming out to remind you that everything is always moving and being. So let's take a look at some other just homes, shall we say, that are happening in and around the area and what it's looking at in terms of, and we'll talk a little bit later about why be historic, why not be historic, what are the problems and everything else. But Joe Eichler was one of the more prolific 1950s developer. He now has a following of people that are in their mid-30s to young 40s. Over 20,000 people visit this particular website. He produced over 11,000 homes in California, many of them up and around the Bay areas. Palo Alto came in a year ago with 2 subdivisions, one 242 homes, another one with 78 homes, and got it nominated on the National Register because they had pride in it. And Eichler really wasn't crazy. He hired Anson and Allen, Jones and Emmons, Claude Oakland, to help design the homes. He loved Frank Lloyd Wright, but he loved Neutra more, he loved Ed Killingsworth more. He wanted to design middle-class homes that would be racially integrated. And one of the most famous pictures are a little black kid, a little white kid walking down, hands in hands, in an Eichler development. When this was nominated, it was nominated not just for its architecture, but also how it changed a view in terms of housing. So now this has sprung, I think, a whole interest in this entire period, post-war up until the 70s. Atomic Ranch and all these great little magazines. Next one. And it's interesting that the folks that are jumping on board of this are not from a preservation, architectural focus. They're from a design focus. Because up until we had this type of architecture, we had revival styles of all kinds. Even when Charlie Moore was studying, he was studying a lot of the Beaux-Arts traditions, and the forward-holster attitudes, and how spaces transcend from one another. But really, with Wright and some of the earlier ones now, have formed a unique American design. The Sea Ranch, of course, has been on that docket for many years, and one of the first to do it. Next. A lot of people say, well, maybe it's just a fad we're going through. Well, it could be, but usually fads are picked up and not really recognized by, for instance, paint manufacturers. So here we have, and I can't remember what the paint guys are, I'm sure it's on there anyway, but now they have their own colors. There's a whole new cottage industry that's come out. Next. This is my house up in Idlewild. It's kind of your equivalent of the Sea Ranch. I go up there ever so often. It's being restored. It's from 1969. And it was an attempt to look at the nomadic character of people moving around during this time of the 60s. It's interesting that in 1972, only 3 years after Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, that the Monsanto house, the House of Tomorrow in Disneyland, was demolished to make way for new and more modern homes. Can't get this nominated because Matthew Sheridan, even though he's a Finnish architect living in Finland, is still alive. Next. Let's come back to the Sea Ranch. The Halpern process, it's kind of interesting that, and you see it around a lot now. I had a chance to stay in Charlie Moore's unit for a couple nights. I was just reading all the stuff in the books. 1/3 of it was in languages I didn't understand. Japanese, Chinese, Taiwanese, I'm not really sure, but it was characters that were there, or very crudely written English, and rather poor English, like I speak. Of course, I speak like, well, I'll never send anybody to a dictionary, let me put it that way. But it's interesting on this 1978 reprint, Japanese reprint, to where the English is misspelled, is that on this sketch, Halpern had written architectural restriction, question mark, question mark. These are going to be hard to establish, question mark, question mark. So he says, here's what we should have. One is a stable of architects to where we don't have to go through a review process. Well, that fell away, didn't it? 2, materials. Are the materials that we're using today appropriate for materials coming in the past? And he had noted that plastics seemed to be the thing of the day in the 60s. And 3, submissions. Well, perhaps we should have an architectural commission that's made up of people other than architects to have some validity to the process. Next. So as we have some structures like the 1868 Ned Slingle barn placed on the National Register in 1989, we have other properties that really capture the flavor. And I love these little stables. I don't see too many horses in them, but I'm assuming they come and go maybe in trailers and are stored there for an evening or something like a lot of us that come over here. Next. Or lots of award homes. And that's what you see on the wall. They're award homes in the sense that they have been acknowledged of having some unique design to them, working within the context of the CC&Rs. And we'll talk about we'll talk about the ramifications of historic stuff versus CC&Rs, but I can tell you right now, I had my staff do a comparison And your CCRs are so far over the edge in terms of control. I mean, you even talk about Christmas decorations. I mean, something that you would never even find. More in Turnbull, 1970. Shepherd's Close by Lyndon Buchanan, 1989. It's interesting that this received 4 awards. Sunset Magazine for the use of materials, AIA San Francisco chapter, the Honor Design for Excellence, Metropolitan Home Magazine, and American Wood Council. When you look at that, it looks like all the rest, doesn't it? So it's kind of interesting that if you look at Santa Barbara, which doesn't have a historic preservation element in their general plan, for instance, but yet you go there and you have the sameness of this. But there's no signature architects that practice in the city of Santa Barbara because they don't want to be told what their colors are, what the shapes are going to be, where they're going to have their windows, what materials in the doors, what their setbacks and stuff are going to be. And yet here, architects that are signature architects come here and working with their clients, not only stay within the CC&Rs, but offer something to the peer reviews, the architectural community at least, that show that they can not only comply, but create something unique. Or, for instance, when Don and Linda decided to do additions to this house in 2002, again, he magically blended together the original design. So you're not even strapped with having additions that almost double or increase the square footage, as long as it fits within the CC&Rs. Next. Another one by Don in 1991. There's a flashback that he had after this. He says, there was, among the original working group, an extraordinary commonality of purpose, which I reflect as a sea ranch. The shared love of the place that placed the land at the center of our attention. And for this he received 2 awards, an AIA award and a Sea Ranch Design Award. I think this is Dick's house. Dmitry Beninsky in 1968 designed this, received an award on it. Clustered in, and nice. Next one. 1986, the Sea Ranch Community Enhancement Award, which is a grouping dealing with several buildings placed together, and it's hard to distinguish one from another in terms of design. By Hebb and Bradley Scott, even one it's called Manufactured Homes. Well, I guess whoever Manufactured Homes is came in, and Don Jacobs. Walk on Beach, Turnbull, 1989. Next. And then a whole group, and to me this is really the Sea Ranch. And even though Walk on the Beach has something, I think as you go through, and you're not really looking at street names, but you're looking at places. Black Point, Pebble Beach, Smuggler's Cove, Del Mar Point, and all of these have distinct and memorable environments within themselves because they all have a different type of texture and color and movement at these places. Next. Geisler House by Don Jacobs, received 2 awards. Next. Namor Turnbull, received the award. You'd swear if you came to the Sea Ranch and you didn't know who the architects were, I don't think you could tell the difference between the architects unless you've been here for a while. And you could start to see little bits and pieces of signatures, like the next one, which is, of course, Obie Bowman. No doubt about a lot of his signature pieces here, but within the flexibility of design in the CC&Rs. And Obie had a nice quotation. He had a great article in Harold Smith in about 1989, and he said, much of what is needed to build a truly environmentally harmonious home, people don't want. And I think that was neat because, as with James Hubbell's designs, critics always confuse these as being the Hobbit revival architecture. So, Condo 1 today. I think you're going to hear from a lot of the original pioneers, or settlers as I call them, that they'll say that once the original designers left, the dream began to tarnish. It's still not bad, but it's not what it once was. Well, I say to that, isn't that the most with everything? I think we're all sort of there. Condo 1 today is certainly not Condo 1 that it was 40 years ago, But to a new sea rancher coming on board, it still conveys the same feeling of sea ranch. Remember that isolated picture of it out there by the bluffs where there was absolutely no vegetation, but it still conveys that. It's certainly not Club Med, as we see with a lot of other developments. But people came here because they're environmentally concerned, as they saw a consciousness to preserve the environment, not necessarily set out to just build their home. And I think that Louis Kahn once said, and this is something I think we need to discuss in our meeting, is that people with lots of possessions need large places to display them. Okay, Charlie Moore's theatrical interior as a stage set, of course. I think this is done. You know, it's sort of frozen in time. And I think it's great that the Japanese can come here and understand, at least in their own vision, the vitality and the vigor and the experimentation at this time. But I much prefer Obi Bowman that he says that, you know, Sea Ranch is sort of like us. We're sort of in our middle years, maybe even later years for some of us. Thicker around the middle, putting bigger and bulky homes on the lots, and dressing them with larger pieces of redwood clothing. And I really don't like to use the word preservation when I give talks because it reminds me of preservatives, it reminds me of frozen food, it reminds me of something being static. I think it's more important of stewardship that we have with the land, or like Moore said, that a house should make its inhabitants feel that they are at the center of the world. And that's really what we're after. Next. So I thought I'd throw this up here because this is the thinking now where we're going in the rest of the United States. You know, modernism, when it began, and this is considered Sea Ranch to be a modern movement, had really taken the offensive against tradition in the 1930s and scored a clear victory after World War II. However, most of these forms that you see up there, and I'll go through them really quickly, are rigid, they're abstractional, they look like they're performed by industrial materials, or they're just buildings made of pure objects of art. They really don't function very well. We also went through a very short-lived period, thank God, that was called brutalism. And we actually identified which was, don't touch me because I'm really rough. The Sea Ranch, though, was and continues to be unique. So as we look back on this, this is a series of stamps that came out last year. And it's kind of interesting because the stamps criteria has very much like the National Register of Historic Places. First of all, any element that comes on cannot be reintroduced until 50 years later. Exceptions to that are celebrations like 500-year landfall of Columbus, 150-year celebration of California, so they can kind of come in and come back again. It's also interesting that no living person can be on a stamp. You have to be dead before they honor a stamp to you. Not too different than what Bill likes to do with the National Register. So they kind of got around this a little bit because, as you'll notice, you see Walt Disney Concert Hall by Frank Gehry up there, and I'll go through these really quickly. Well, he's still alive. So how do you know that he designed that? Well, you turn that little sucker over on the back, and on the back of the stamps, because remember these are now not lickies, they're all peel and sticks. So you have now the architect's name on the back of the stamps that you're buying. So let me make sure I don't screw this up. So as we start around the Guggenheim Museum by Frank Lloyd Wright, 1959 in New York. The Chrysler Building at William Van Allen, 1930. The Vanna Venturi House by Robert Venturi in 1964 in Philadelphia, which gave a great tribute to Charlie Moore when he passed away, saying that his architecture was the most extreme poetry I have ever read. He also said, another great quote, is that we hate the architecture of our fathers, but we love the architecture of our grandfathers. The TWA Terminal by Sheridan, 1962. This is where Bill Murtagh broke his thing and nominated the TWA Terminal to the National Register when it was only 35 years old because he wanted to protect it from additions being added to it. Frank Gehry's Concert Hall, 2003. Lakeshore Drive by Mies van der Rohe, 1951. National Gallery of Art by IMA, 1978. The Glass House of course, Philip Johnson, 1949. The Yale Art and Architecture by Paul Rudolph in 1963. Richard Myers High Museum of Art in Atlanta. The Exeter Academy Library by Louis Kahn. It's interesting that they did not put the Salk Institute on there, 1971. And the Hancock Center by Bruce Graham of Skidmore, Orange, and Maryland, 1970, Chicago. Now it's interesting that only one of these unique, as he calls it, the masterworks of modern American architecture. This series cannot come back until 50 years from now. You only get one crack at this on your stamps. So it won't come back, at least on stamps, until 50 years from now. So I'm trying to think what we're going to be looking at in 50 years. But it's interesting, only one is west of Mississippi. That's Frank Gehry's Walt Disney Hall, built 3 years ago. 9 of these are less than 50 years old, and 5 out of the 12 architects are still alive. Now it's interesting because part of the process of submitting the stamps is you have to make up the whole stamp just like it's going to be printed from the post office. So you have to go through all of this artwork, so when you submit it, it looks exactly like this. So who submitted this? Paul Goldberger. Paul Goldberger is a New York Times architectural critic. And my question is, what would happen if the National Park Service, in writing the National Register of Historic Places, started in San Francisco? And what if the stamps that were generated for this were by the Los Angeles Times architectural critic instead of Paul Goldberger? I think we would have a much different look on it. So let's go back to, I'm almost finished here. Let's go back to the pigs. Not sheep, the pigs. I don't want to offend anybody here. I probably will, but I don't want to offend anybody because I'm not calling anybody out there pigs. But sheep, I think, relate lightly on the land for the sea ranch. Pigs are big. Pigs say, look at me. Are fat pigs pretty? Of course they are. Because they have little piglets, so they must be pretty. Not sure about pelicans, but certainly pigs are there. But all pigs also have a heart. And I think that the sense of community that we're looking at the Sea Ranch is still a challenge for its heart amongst all of the people that are coming here. I feel a division a little bit. For the people that have been here, it's almost like the NIMBYs in a way, and the people that are coming in maybe quite don't get it. But we still have a lot of homes to build, and there's a lot of homes that have been built. So let's go back to the roots. It's the simplicity of the old barn that has the strength and character of the farmer that built it. He wasn't an architect. He didn't theorize on the architectural style of the region and what was there before. I'm sure he also wasn't concerned about the global environmental movement, but he did understand one thing. He knew how to build a barn. He knew how to protect what was in the barn. He knew what the forces were on the land. He also understood the conservation of materials. He worked with a renewable resource, and to him, it was just plain common sense. So instead of this modernism movement that everybody else was doing, Al Boeke got from his designers that the Sea Ranch buildings were not to be married to the site, but to enter into a limited partnership with it, which means that it may not be here, it meaning your home, and that the architectural vocabulary was a respect to the environment. So as Larry Halpin once said, he said, in those days, the North Coast was wild, unfriendly, mostly uninhabited, and sometimes belligerent. I've never even looked at the Pacific Ocean that way in my whole life. He said the constant presence of the Pacific was dominant. It was magical. Now, I think in those days or these days, I don't think we have a new ocean out there. Certainly we don't have too many new rocks. did plant a lot of stuff here. But I think it's important to return to these roots. Perhaps this is through the design committee, I'm not sure. But like all of us, and if we take our Homa Indian friends as an example, is that we don't own anything here. We really don't. But what we are is we're custodians while we're here, and we should be custodians of a very precious and fragile system that we have at the Sea Range. Thank you. Now, I know that part of the agenda, I was supposed to talk a little bit about what they used to be called thematic districts. They're not called thematic districts anymore, meaning those particular resources that are grouped together under a certain theme. The correct would be multiple properties listing. The reason why they got away from that is because themes necessarily, we don't have to look at one theme, but I thought I would give you a few of what has happened over the past, because you can understand what that means. And then we can discuss, if you wish, in details on that.
Wayne, could I just change tape for one? Give me 30 seconds so we don't miss anything.
Let's take a 5 minute.
Did you on stage?
I'd like to ask you now, please sit down. Please sit down so we can continue the program. Thank you. Hush, children, sit down.
Just going to require you to stand up. Oh, late, as usual. Bring it back. Bring it back. Yeah, well, parked a long way.
Yeah, I thought it looks like it's raining.
Thanks for coming back. I thought I would give you some, just an overview of a few of these multiple properties listings that we have in California. And we have a great website, and I'll post these on here because we did a collection of them. If you ever want to go to our post site, it's www.ohp.parks.ca.gov.
Can you do that again?
Yeah, www.parks.ca.gov. Office of Historic Preservation, California State Parks, California Government. There you go. I'm here to help you. One is the light stations in California. This was accepted by the National Park Service in 1990, and it's basically in the area of California marine history, transportation, and commerce during the years of 1840 to 1940. And I was invited to stay at the Point Marina Lighthouse tonight, so I'm really looking forward to that. So again, there's no real large board around them, but there's 10 of these listed. The California Carnegie Libraries. It was also listed in 1990 in terms of social history during the years of 1849 to 1921. As you know, Carnegie was very generous, and in the teens and 20s, he gave a lot of money out, $25,000 per unit. He also sent along a design that you could follow, but it wasn't mandatory. So that, for instance, in Eureka, it's made out of redwood, kind of unique Carnegie Library. And 14 of these libraries have been listed as part of the multiple property. So what it is, it's a collection of similar pieces and parts that were primarily designed or focused under different criteria. It doesn't have to necessarily be in the area of design. Lillian Rice designed buildings in Rancho Santa Fe. This is from 1923 to 1938, which is kind of unique in that it was the first, there was a lot of argument whether it was Palos Verdes or Rancho Santa Fe as being the first planned community, and it is Rancho Santa Fe by Lillian Rice, one of our earliest women architects, and in that a lot of residential and commercial properties are nominated, something like 27 of these properties. I'm not going to read all of these. I think the U.S. Post Offices in California, 22 of those have been nominated, and some of these are only 40 years old, which is kind of neat. They're all listed now in the National Register. They all have different sub-themes in terms of their styles. Non-governmental architectural firms design some of them. Some of them are purchased under different funding bills, so they share a 40-year history of development, which is kind of unique. And the last, which is kind of weird, although it's coming more and more, as we can see, it's called the Early Auto-Related Properties in Pasadena, California. And you think, Pasadena has a real strong historic preservation ethic and stuff. But again, it doesn't have a preservation element in their general plan. It's just because the people want to do it. And this is kind of neat because it covers a theme of properties in Pasadena from 1897. I'm trying to think what my 1897 automobile was, to 1944. Again, just during the war years. And it has all 4 historic contents associated with events, people, the design. And it's interesting that it includes car washes, commercial garages, parking structures, drive-in businesses such as markets where you can drive in and get your milk and stuff, restaurants, laundries. I guess they had drive-in laundries back then. And auto-related signage such as road markers, street signs, and commercial signage. So it's kind of interesting that these properties, which are up in the neighborhood of 40 some odd properties in terms of a multiple property thing. And I guess part of that is because of this very, very strong movement that we have now in heritage tourism. It was interesting, I was in Napa yesterday, talking to the city of Napa and the county and a lot of the other smaller communities on looking at this heritage tourism. As you have probably seen from some of the ads on television, Arnold Schwarzenegger has got together with Clint Eastwood and Jack Nicholson. In fact, I think Jack has the last slot in most of those things. In promotion of California, because it was always assumed that everybody just comes to California. But in fact, other competing states like Nevada, in terms of special towns in Nevada that have gaming institutions, seem to be overrunning us now. So this historical content or heritage tourism now is a big push. And the National Park Service now is working on Route 66. And we have a component, of course, that starts from Needles and ends up in Santa Monica, although it originally ended up in downtown LA. Drawing several millions of dollars. We have a Cesar Chavez historic corridor coming from Yuma, going on up to Salinas. We have a 101 that's primarily now all in functioning from San Diego on up to San Clemente. And we'll continue on further. And we're also working on, for instance, the Sierra Business District on Route 49, taking not only just Route 49, but taking up from the village of Locke through the Delta all the way up to the gold fields. It seems as though 80-some odd percent, 81% of tourists now are looking for heritage tourism. Now that's kind of the antithesis to the Sea Ranch. I don't think you want a bunch of heritage tourism folks coming up here and doing whatever heritage tourism people want, but you already have it. And you have it because of the design of the Sea Ranch. It's world-renowned, and people come here to see it. Now, they don't necessarily come up and pound on your door and want to come in your room, but they want to see what the Sea Ranch was all about. So, and it's only 40 years old. I'm 41 years old. So, I think as we tend to see this is that, in my own personal thing, I think what maybe made a more awareness, I was thinking that maybe the bicentennial had a lot to do with it in 1976, with the Freedom Train sort of bringing Americans closer together is what they have. But I think it was really 9/11 that brought a lot of people together that our resources are rather fragile. So in New Orleans and the disaster and stuff, not only architecture and buildings, but really people, neighborhoods, and part of the significance. I can't imagine that portion of New Orleans ever being like New Orleans I was used to and have been to many times. No matter what you do, you cannot build that type of culture that has existed over the number of years. So anyway, I think I'm not going to stand up here alone, I'll tell you that. Al, do you want to come up here or whatever? And I think maybe, Pamela, you should explain what some of the concepts, or let me try to do this. Part of the multiple properties concepts, to be nominated to the National Register is not really going to fit well within the envelope of the Sea Ranch because of two items that I've already mentioned before. One is that it has to be older than 50 years of age, or it has to be exceptional. And there are a lot of properties that have been nominated because they are exceptional to it. And the other thing we have is that the designer, the architect, the builder, whoever, the creator, shall we say, of that particular potential resource has to be dead, which is not an exciting thing, I'm sure, for Al. Or Dick, I think I saw Dick come in. So, by the way, somebody asked me, well, how in the heck did Condo 1 then get listed not only to the National Register, but at the national level of significance? National level of significance means that it had a national impact at the time it was built. Because then you can default to state. In other words, if it was built in the state, it had a state impact that it had, or you default to the third level on the National Register, it had local significance. In other words, it had a major local significance. And there's over 200,000 properties listed on the National Register, so there's a lot of properties listed on the National Register, but not a whole bunch at the national level. So somebody asked me that. Well, when we're working with Pam, we told her that we're going to have to come up with some sort of a spin on this that would make it work. And I thought about the Beatles, because we seem to honor pictures that come right out with our Academy Awards. We don't wait 50 years and then come back and say, that picture 50 years ago was a pretty good one. I think we should nominate it. We also recognize songs that are important to us at this time and other movement moves, even people that are young artists. And I think you're seeing some great emergence from Al Forrester, an old friend of mine from San Diego, now branching out and not doing architectural delineations, but doing his own watercolors. So we decided to say, well, the Beatles are never going to play the same music again. Now, it was kind of a farce in a way, because the original architects that worked together, I think they're only together 2 years after they did Sea Ranch, and then they went their own way. So it's not like they've been together for all their life working together. And in fact, this piece of property is the property for what they worked on. Because we're biting two things. One is that we had two living architects, Don and Dick, and Al, which he considers himself to just be a builder in this, but in fact being an architect and being involved is really one of the architects. And of course, we also had Larry Halpert, who had a major force in working with Al on this because of their earlier work that they had in Hawaii, which you guys were doing. And he was also, of course, alive, but almost dropped out. And we had the opposite. It was only 40 years old when we nominated it. Most of these things that we nominate that are pushing 50, they're like 48, 49 years old. So at least we can see if we got a good chance. But because of the exceptional quality and what the Sea Ranch started, not necessarily as a lifestyle, but just a different way to look at things in general, is that we felt we had a good case, and we put it in, and guess what? It went through on the first go. It was written that well by Pam Carlson that it went through. And most of us are still shocked, and I got to tell you that when I did the presentation of the Sea Ranch, because the Sea Ranch and the Salk Institute are on the Guide to the Modern Movement, book that was published 3 years ago, and they're on facing covers of one another. Sea Ranch is on one, and the Salk Institute is on the other. When the other SHPOs, the other state historic preservation officers from the other states heard this, they were absolutely amazed. And of course, they went right to the new keeper, Jan Walters, and asked her how. Of course, she's new. Point is, she didn't know how. She didn't review it, so she kind of dodged the bullet. So I think it's important to realize what you have at the time that you have it, rather than the criteria for the 50-year was to allow 2 generations to pass, so that third generation, so basically there's nobody to talk to, so that you can reassess it, which kind of kills our oral history program that the Park Service started about 20 years ago, to get stuff from the people that are living now, at least on tape and pictures and video, so they can have the remembrance. It's not important at facts. In other words, they don't have to remember the date. That's not important. The date's not important. What was the event and the circumstances that created whatever you did? So, we're not alone. There's other people that are doing this in other areas besides just environment and planning and architecture. So, any questions? You have to have some questions. What are the opportunities and constraints, I guess? Well, certainly
What does it mean to be on the registry?
It's now more of an honor than anything else. For instance, if you're on the National Register of Historic Places, you can demolish the building. It does not protect the building from being demolished. The only program that the National Parks has is investment tax credits, or what they call their conservation easements, where you take your federal tax credits on it, and then you basically are giving up easement rights for the demolition of that particular building. But to be on the National Register, in fact, most of the cities now that are going through, like in my former life, when I was doing a resurvey of La Jolla, their survey was dated 1978. They had 200 buildings on that survey, and since that time, 57 buildings were already demolished or severely altered. So that's, once you go through, it's there. So that's one of the items, is that it doesn't really leave you the protection that it's going to stay there. Almost every building that's listed on the National Register, unless the interiors have been nominated, like the interiors of some of these grand theaters that you find in San Francisco and Los Angeles and area, is they don't really care what you do to the interior. You can add additions to it. In fact, I added a tremendous addition to a little historic building down in the outside of the gas headquarters in San Diego. It used to be called the Western Metal building. It was a 4-story brick building, approximately 100 by 100. It held all the metals for sale, including stoves and horseshoes and all that sort of stuff. It was built in 1910, and the developer wanted to build what is now Petco Park in San Diego, which is our new ballpark that we had down there. And we wanted to try to keep it somehow within the ballpark. And in doing so, it didn't meet any of the criteria for building a large ballpark. In other words, you can't have flammable materials. It's all wood construction inside. It was unreinforced masonry. We're moving probably 12 to 14,000 people through there a day, so you had life safety issues and exits and everything else. So I decided to try to put the spin on it, and I said, well, we're going to make an addition to this historic building. And the addition is going to be a 44,000-seat, $500 million stadium. So that's what the building department did to me, so I appealed to the State Historic Building Safety Board, which administers this, and they said, fine, because we don't control how large the addition is going to be. They said it has to comply with today's stern code. So, and I think I showed you that Donaldson's addition to the Turnbull house, which almost doubled its square footage. Your CC&Rs are far more restrictive, and it's nice that I did the analysis with staff because I was wanting to really know how this fits. Is much more restrictive that when you buy into the C Ranch and you look at those particular CC&Rs, they're much more restrictive than anything that you would find in the National Register. For instance, one of the things on the National Register, when they want you to add additions, for instance, they want it to be distinctive but compatible, which is kind of an oxymoron for me. And their attitude is they want to really see it because they want to see where the original one is. And I think that's kind of the antithesis that you would have at the C Ranch when you folks do additions and you come back and you fix the board. You don't come back in and put on this concrete siding that weathers for the, to the year 5000 or something. I mean, you come back and you replace pieces in kind. They're almost doing, to me, the Secretary's Interior standards for rehab because it's a conservation attitude. And I don't see the restrictions, but let's talk about the downside. The downside would be if you wanted to demolish the building. Let's say, for instance, you wanted to level that sucker down to the ground and come back up in your lot and build something new. Because that is the problem with a lot of the urban inner cities like La Jolla. La Jolla is not the La Jolla I remember. La Jolla is completely different because you can't expect a person to come in and purchase a 1,200 square foot home, 1,200 square foot home bungalow that's built in the teens or early 20s. And on this tiny little lot, they just paid $1 million for it. Doesn't make sense. Because generally the ratio of land value to building value is normally your building will cost 3 times your land value, normally. That's just the general ratio that most people use. So they're not just buying one lot and putting up their maxi pads, as I call them, these huge 3-story boxes. They're buying 3 or 4 lots, and they're building 15,000 square foot homes that are now adjacent to smaller. So in doing so, and regardless of whether you're on the register, if your structure is older than 45 years, we have the California Environmental Quality Act. And even if you went in and you were going to do a demolition and the house is older than that, or any structure, then they'll want you to do an assessment on that to see whether or not it is eligible as a historic resource. That would be the downside, is that if you just wanted to come in and demolish it and your house is less than approximately 45 years old, then you will be able to go ahead and demolish it and build whatever you want. Otherwise, you're going to have to go through basically showing that it is either not historic, it's not significant, whatever that is, and certainly there's probably a lot of homes out here that fit that category, I'm sure. And that's why I think that the Archives Committee has tried to identify those homes that would be exceptional because they have been honored by other peers and or either the community itself as being, I guess, in the spirit of the Sea Ranch. But I got to tell you that even those homes by themselves, when you do a multiple listing, and here's the key, when you do a multiple listing, each one of those sites have to be eligible by themselves to be listed to the National Register. Even though it may be at local significance, it doesn't have to be at national or state, but it still has to be at local. And that may be a push. Maybe a push to do that. Yes?
So if the Sea Ranch is listed, and I want to put an addition on my house, or I want to replace my split, worn-out redwood siding with new fireproof siding, do I have to get permission from the National Park Service as well as the design committee?
No. Once you have a design committee rules in that sense, but we're not talking about the Sea Ranch as being a historic district. In other words, taking the boundaries of the Sea Ranch as it was developed, because it would never get there. It would never qualify for that.
So what are we talking about?
I think what you're talking about is honoring those specific, unique, the ones that we see in yellow up here.
You call them contributing.
Contributing. In other words, they would then be like a multiple properties contributors, I guess, to that. Like I had mentioned, for instance, the lighthouses. Even though they're on separate sites and separate places, they're all tied together because of the same theme that you have. And also you have to have the owner's permission to do that. So if the owner doesn't want to do it, then so be it. Yes?
So each of these owners would have to agree, each of the yellow marked lots would have to agree to become part of the preservation district or whatever.
Yeah, that's correct. The thing with the condominiums is that you have to have over 50% of the people, and I think there was one condominium owner, condominium one, that didn't want to have it listed. But that's a condominium complex where they're all tied together, which is different. Or if the district had a border around it, for instance, we just received the largest district from Pomona. They brought in 1,250 homes in a district that they wanted to have, which I don't even think Pomona had anything going for it. I know Montclair and others, I shouldn't say that because you maybe. But they brought in that, and they had about 4 or 5 people that didn't want to become part of that district. But that was, again, a line drawn around the entire area where then all the homes, and then a lot of sites, of course, are not contributing. Sites that are too new, buildings that perhaps don't meet the period of significance, and that would be the other thing that you'd have to decide is how far up is the period of significance, and how do you put a handle on that? I mean, would it be 1991 when Charlie Moore got his gold medal, being one of only 12 architects to get the gold medal since it began? I mean, I don't know where you would really put that, where you would put that range of stuff. Certainly if you put 1965, which I think is condo 1, or 66, that's 1 year and that's it. So I mean, if Sea Ranch then, in terms of, let's say, the demonstration houses by Esrig, perhaps a lodge, all fits within that 60, 60, 72, then any other homes built within that period, then period of significance would be eligible should they want to apply and come in. But I got to tell you, with the multiple listing, it has to be, and it's less than 40 years old, and a living architect, all those things, it has to be exceptional. I mean, it really has to be exceptional. I don't want you to get your hopes up, because I know Pam's got her hopes up if the tendency is wanting to go that way, but it's going to be a real uphill battle. Yes?
What are the desires for accessibility to the public? All the Sea Ranch roads are private, so you've got a bunch of places that the public can't get to unless they rent a house.
Same thing. Same thing. Privacy is still there. The only exception to the privacy thing are California landmarks. Those are the ones with the little bear plaques.
Right.
And that bear plaque has to be within a quarter mile, and the resource should be in view. But that's a real old program. That's a program that goes back to the 1930s. But you can, I don't know if anybody has any buildings that are on the National Register. I'm sure that people are not, you don't have to let access to the property or to your house, that's for sure. We have a frequently asked questions on our website about property values and all that sort of stuff, and what do I need to do if it becomes that and all that. And I really welcome you to get on that. It's not as scary as you may think. It has proved to be, though, not so much, I don't think, with the older structures, but with this modern movement, there are a couple realtors now that's all they specialize in, is what they call signature architects properties. And they are just getting prices like this. Joe Eichler, which, he's a good guy, but he was a builder. I mean, 11,000 homes. I mean, give me a break. And those Eichler homes now, that you could probably pick up for a couple $100,000, and they leak like a sieve. The details are crappy. And stuff now are going for $3,000 to $4,000 because it's no longer I want to own a Victorian, or I want to own a Craftsman. Basically, I want to own an Eichler, or I want to own a Neutron, or I want to own Turnbull, or Bowman, or whatever. That's where people are coming from. They're not coming from the style stuff anymore. And having gone through the 60s and got my education on it, I was kind of like Robert Venturi's camp. I really love Craftsman homes, and I have 2 down in San Diego. And I'm thinking, gee whiz. Of course, I do have a signature condominium in Sacramento, which is nice, and I painted it up those colors like you see up there. It's kind of fun. But I'm wondering, maybe I was missing something when I was going to school. Yes.
Since this is a very special and unique place and community, what role, if any, should the Board of Directors of the association and the general membership have in this process?
I think they should approve.
Should they be
Well,
involved?
I think
is the
I
question.
think once you get involved, and you're more than welcome to work with the staff of my office if you want to do this. I think you're going to have a tremendous uphill battle in doing this. I think it would be more appropriate, and that's why I like the legacy approach a little bit more, is that I think the promotion of all of these buildings that have received awards but look so similar in their character are incredible designs, to say the least. And I think that's what I would try to celebrate more. I think time is going to have to be on your side for this, and then depending upon where you cut the period of significance, because the 50-year threshold is much more difficult, I'm finding, than the living architect right now, because we seem to have broken through that policy on the living architect, and only because there's so many people out there doing it. But the 50-year threshold is going to be a little difficult. And I got to tell you, I'm still amazed that the National Register was only supposed to last up until the Second War. I still can't believe Bill told me that. When it was first devised in '66. Yes?
I'm interested in the cluster homes in Unit 29A, the townhouses and the walk-in cabins. I noticed that all of them are colored yellow on the map here. And I was wondering what would happen if the proposed multiple properties idea was accepted as a national historical whatever. I imagine that some of the owners of these cluster homes will want to be included and some won't. And I was wondering if you could end up with a situation where the Sea Ranch multiple properties is accepted as historically significant, but could that happen with only some of the
Yes.
properties but not others in these clusters?
Yes.
So it would be a patchwork?
Right.
That would work. Okay.
In terms of the multiples, you can have 2 properties qualify for that. So you don't, and in fact, that was one that was in Naval Shipyards, both at the one that was up in Alameda, that was Vallejo, Mare Island, and the one down in Long Beach. Of course, the one in Long Beach was torn down, and they were both tied together. And that it was called Thematic at that time. Yes.
Second question. What requirements would then fall on the design committee? You said that the design committee basically would take on the responsibility of looking at these, and they would presumably have to look at them in a separate way from everything else. So what responsibilities would fall on that design
Well,
committee?
actually, if you kept your CC&Rs together as they now are, there would be more restrictive than compliance with the Secretary's Interior standards. For instance, the standards don't qualify you in terms of how much you can add to the historic building. In other words, but your CC&Rs do. I don't think that your CC&Rs would allow an owner to combine 2 lots here that are contiguous with one another and build a 15,000 square foot unit. I don't think they would. I don't think that your CC&Rs in certain zones would allow you to go over the 20-foot height like you have. Again, the standards have no criteria towards that. One thing that it does make it nice historically, that the CC&Rs, even if you wanted to do additions coming in, is that you do not have to comply with the regular code when you're doing change. In other words, energy requirements, double painting, size of openings, thermal loss or heat loss, through the envelope. Certain toilets, you don't have to put in ground faulted intercepts on all these things that weren't around in the 60s. If you're coming back and doing an interior for some reason that you want to keep intact, then you don't have to comply with that. You comply with the state historic building code. There's also grants available, not too many grants for single family, unless you entered into the Mills Act. The Mills Act allows you to save about 60% on your taxes, so that's a good deal.
The tax benefits, if it's a rental property, you want to rehabilitate or renovate it, what is it, 20% tax break if you're on the national?
That's the investment tax credits, that's if you're on the national register, but that applies to commercial properties.
That's what I'm saying.
So if you are renting and let's say you're do $1 million worth of work, then the government will give you back $200,000. And basically that's a 7-year adjustment scale, so you go back, or you can save or forward. And it's a 5-year program that you have to then, once you go through and do your rehab, you have to keep it for 5 years. After 5 years, then you can do whatever you want to do with it. But it comes off your federal taxes. It's not a state tax, it's a federal tax. Not off your taxable income, but off your It's very good for downtown commercial properties. That's why you see so many larger buildings being nominated to the National Register, or districts being formed to where the building is considered to be contributing to the register, while by themselves would never stand and never meet the criteria, but as a contributor to the district, like the Gaslamp District or areas in Los Angeles and stuff, then they can take advantage of those tax credits. So again, it's just a financial incentive. Yes?
Just a question about demolition again. You mentioned it, I'm not sure I understood. If a structure was on the National Register, it may not be demolished, is that what I'm understanding?
No, it can be demolished, but if it is, it's going to require a CEQA review, California Environmental Quality Act review, which means that you will need to go through alternative, let's say it's already historic, you're going to have to go through alternatives that will show why you can't keep it. Most of those are economic things, and usually the way the spins are put on them, and especially in the inner city. Let's say in the inner city you had a 2-story or a 1-story, 5,000 square foot building, and everywhere around you are 4- and 5-story buildings, and you want to do something. So you want to either add 4 stories and just keep the facade, or basically demolish it and build up. You would probably show that the economic constraints in terms of the property would outweigh its historic significance, and fortunately or unfortunately, a lot of them come down that way. A lot of them came down in the early years because owners didn't want to comply with seismic retrofits in the city of Los Angeles when the retrofit thing came out in '85. However, their ground floor was pretty good, but the upper floors, because they couldn't comply with code and exiting and fire and everything else, so they just demolished a 5-story building down to 1 floor, because that was when it was making income for itself. Yeah.
Since the subject focuses on only those Sea Ranch houses that have already been awarded special recognition, if that were to come to pass, I understand there would be certain tax benefits, perhaps certain increased in value as to those houses. Most of us don't live or own those houses. What are the consequences to us in the event that this theme were to become a reality and those houses go on the National Register? What advantages, disadvantages, consequences to the rest of us?
Since it's not a district and it would be a multiple property, there'd be no consequences at all. If it was a district, in other words, a hard line drawn around the entire thing, then as your particular home became older and would fit within that period of significance, then consideration could be given as to whether it would be contributing or not to the historic district.
But it's clear it's not going to be a district.
No.
So you say absolutely no consequences to those of us who own properties, not the subject of this whole business.
Correct. Yes.
What if one of these properties is either destroyed or demolished through a natural disaster?
Like a fire?
Or not quick?
No, that's taken off the register.
The ashes are put into an urn and buried.
Just that's it. But one of the nice things, let's say it is destroyed by earthquake or by fire, because that happened to Jim Hubble's place down in Cedar Fires. up in Julian. And if it's already on the register, then you can basically reconstruct that in kind, not have to worry about new zoning laws, and build your stairways back the same way, but you have to have enough either drawings or pictures or whatever to show that particular feature as you're reconstructing it. And you don't have to comply with the Title 24 energy requirements and all that sort of stuff. You do have to meet current life safety codes, in other words, your plumbing has to work and all of that sort of stuff. You can't put in your old pipes, for instance. So that's one advantage, and that's one of the 4 treatments under the National Historic Preservation Act for the Secretary of Interior standards. One is preservation or stabilization, which just keep what you got. One is restoration, where you're taking it back to a certain period that was important. The other one is rehabilitation, which basically means you keep pretty much the exterior walls and you do whatever you want to do on the interior because it's for a different use, which doesn't really pertain to the Sea Ranch. Or 3 is reconstruction. The reconstruction came after Hurricane Andrew back in the back in the 80s, I guess, early 80s. When it blew through, is that a lot of the Carolina states and the southern states wanted to reconstruct a lot of things that had been blown over, or rooftops were removed. And the building codes were coming back and saying, oh no, you can't have this, you have to have the Class A roof, yada, yada, yada. So they went ahead and passed that reconstruction element in there. It didn't exist before then. So it's a good benefit. If you want to do that, of course.
I'm curious about the Oakland Hills fire, that some of the homes that were Maydeck homes and things, that, is there posthumous, what is that word? After death or after destruction, can things be, if they have blueprints and stuff, can they get on the National Register at that point, which would allow for them to be rebuilt?
The only time that something that gets demolished and falls apart can be rebuilt and be put back on the National Register is that if it is a state plan, in other words, state historic park, like for instance, what am I thinking of down in Fort Ross, for instance. Of course, that's all reconstructed anyway. Or it's in a historic district and was a contributor before it came in. Or it's part of a National Historic Landmark, like in my neck of the woods, for instance, again, Balboa Park. A lot of those buildings that were built for the last 3 years, they had redwood foundations and stamped plaster for the ornamentation and everything else. Once it's reconstructed, then it's as a contributor. A standalone or a multiple properties can be that way, but a standalone just by itself cannot. If you lose it, you lose it.
So then when people rebuilt the homes that they built with the Oakland fires, they had to, if they wanted to reproduce something, they had to then upgrade it with the current code.
Yeah, the only relaxation they got were setbacks from property lines, although they still had to set it back 5 feet. A lot of garages that were built right on the property line, for instance. We had that after the 1992 earthquake up in Eureka. Ferndale was all up on almost first story stuff, and because of the post-beetle guy getting in there, when they say shook and they fell, they twisted it and it came down like this, so they really weren't aligned to the property line. And we found in order to jack them up, put wheels under, straighten them out and all that, was 6 times the cost of just jacking them up and building the foundation. So we allowed them to jack them up. So when you're driving down some of the streets in Ferndale, you'll see these things are kind of like cockeyed. And so they relaxed the code on that because, as you know, Ferndale isn't a very rich community. They're great crop, but they're not very rich.
Back to, is it preservation tourism, was that the phrase?
Heritage tourism. Heritage tourism. You notice they got away from preservation.
Heritage tourism, okay.
Heritage tourism.
You answered someone else's question and you said that the fact that these homes are all in a private development of private roads means that the public would not have access to them.
Right.
But of course the burden of keeping your roads private falls on the associations and the security. When these are listed, will the listing be very clear that these are private property on private roads and it's not open to the public? Or well, I mean, we're already distributing maps so people can drive around and look at them. And
great point. And you're right, I didn't even think, you guys are distributing these maps.
They've been distributed 5 or 6 times before. These maps are just a composite of earlier award maps.
Yeah,
But they are a roadmap to people who drive
Yeah, the
around,
Heritage-
drive around.
The Heritage Tourism Group outside, I think, maybe foreign architects, and I use the Japanese because they get around a lot, or even some of the local younger architects coming up, I think would have an interest. I'm not sure if the rest of the folks would have an interest in it. But certainly policing that would be, or managing the policing. I can't see, hundreds and hundreds of people in caravans, buses, driving down and pointing out. It just, where do you get the bus? In San Francisco or Bodega? I'm just having a hard time. But no, it's controlled the same way as private property. They're not coming on. So any kind of tour buses or any of that will not be able to come on the property.
If it's listed on your website or wherever these lists appear, will the listing be explicit that this is private property?
No
A
trespass.
private road?
All listings are noted that way. Yeah. Yeah, I'd hate to see you have little gates with your little clickers as you have somebody looking for this stuff. It's one of those things where you become so popular, it's like Lincoln's Cabin, they had to now stop people from coming in. It's just that simple, they're just beating it down. Yes?
I'm just curious the difference between the multiple property listings versus the district listings and how it affects Sea Ranch. What I'm hearing is the local properties are only the buildings on the land, whereas a district would be the buildings in the streets, in the gas lamps, or whatever they are. And so in the Sea Ranch situation, the commons and the whole concept of Sea Ranch living on the land is really not part of the quote historic nomination.
That's correct. Let me go through and try to explain that a little bit more. The Sea Ranch is rather unique on this. Normal districts that you have public right-of-way roads. Unlike, well, of course, Rancho Santa Fe is not. A lot of Rancho Santa Fe is gated. But you have basically public roads with regular lots on them with the houses. And that's kind of how they design it. Some of the earlier garden cities do have, you could come out the back of your house and they had a trail that you could walk behind, so kids could walk to schools out across the road and that kind of thing. But in case of a district, you're right. If you drew a line around the Sea Ranch entire area, then you would be looking at everything. The street signage, which was part of that program, you'd be looking at the lodge, you'd be looking at Moonraker, the pool, you'd be looking at all, you'd be looking at all the buildings and how they contribute to the ambience within some sort of a period of significance. And that's what I think would be the hard thing for the Sea Ranch, because you still have, what, 500 or 600 lots that haven't been built on. So you couldn't nominate a lot without, it would have to have some narrow window of those. And that's why I think the ones that have been flashed up there, except for some maybe the awards after, what, 1989 is when you're getting the Sea Ranch Awards. That's kind of a local award, so in terms of a national significance, it probably doesn't weigh too heavy on that, because that's kind of an internal award, saying, you've done it right or whatever. But when you get to the multiple properties, it would be the lots, and it would simply be that, and that's why each individual resource would have to stand alone in getting nominated, probably at the local significance, but getting nominated on the National Register. So it gets to be problematic, to say the least. Although, I think when Pam wrote the nomination, if my memory serves me right, when you wrote the nomination, you focused heavily on Condo 1, but in terms of the overall philosophy, the planning, and everything else, it was the entire Sea Ranch as that, but not much. You didn't put very much in there.
No, I didn't. I concentrated on condominium 1 and its breakthrough.
Yeah, because if you do 65, there wasn't a whole bunch of stuff, as you can see from the slides. I've shown slides from 72, and it was pretty barren, even at that time. Yes?
The lodge would be and properties, what would be the implications for the expansion of the lodge if this were to go through? And do you happen to know where the new owners of the lodge are with this?
No, I don't, because I'm not initiating this. I'm just trying to give you some information. Remember, I'm from the state. But in terms of the lodge, again, the lodge, when Joe Esrick did the store, that store is no longer really there. I mean, it's been so involved in expansion. Then when Al Boeke came in and added all the other units past him, which was what, another 5 or 6 years later, the same thing can happen now. It's just that when you do it then, it has to be in some sort of a compatible manner, but your CC&Rs will far outweigh the freedom that you have on the National Register. I can't imagine, for instance, concrete structured block form being added to that complex. I don't think your CC&Rs will allow. Certainly stucco would allow that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
No, if it doesn't, ask me again. Yeah.
I just had a question. What is the situation in Monterey? Is that a district?
Yeah, Monterey is a very special area. They have 5 National Historic Landmarks. National Historic Landmarks are extremely unique. There's only, there's 2,030 in all of the United States. Monterey has 5 in its core there. Of course, it makes sense, all right? It was a Spanish, port and then on. In addition to that, they've got 4 California historic state parks that are there. Monterey, though, is quite famous because in 1940, they developed a historic preservation overlay in their general plan. It was the first city in the United States to have it. And the reason being is because they had so much of the original stuff that was still there. In fact, it just got the award, Preservation American Award. We only have 4 in the whole state of California. The Advisory Council for Historic Preservation. This is part of Laura Bush's programs. It's kind of like Hillary Clinton's programs, which was Save America's Treasures. This is Preserve America. Different types of programs. One's brick and mortar and one's acknowledgement. And Monterey just got that last year as having a unique planning thing. But everything that they do in Monterey, is really cared for by the citizens. It's kind of interesting because the post-naval graduate academy that's there want to tear down 5 Skidmore, Orange, and Merrill's buildings, which is kind of interesting. And Nate Owens actually lived down in Big Sur. And Senator Sam Farr, for instance, is having a tussle with it because, he's really in charge of all the naval bases and enclosures and everything else. Because he knew that personally, and his wife, their 2 wives, did Save the Sea Otter campaign back in the early 60s. So, they go back a long way, so he's trying to balance this out. But the city of Monterey is, I think, still doing well. When you really look at some cities like Pasadena and Santa Barbara, portions of Riverside, there's some other ones, Laguna Beach, and areas like this, none of them have preservation overlays in their general plan, because that's what I was discussing with Napa. About 30% of the cities in California and about 20% of the counties have a preservation overlay for planning purposes, pretty much, which is really good compared to other states. But they don't have one because the citizenry have pretty much demanded, how their city council and stuff are going to treat it. But yet, you're never going to have an international architect, if that's important, practice in the city of Santa Barbara, unlike the Sea Ranch. Yeah.
I'd like to make sure, as some others have done, that I have a sort of grip on this situation. When you propose this thematic listing of houses that have contributed in some significant way to the Sea Ranch character.
Yeah, I'm not proposing it.
I know. But when we do, if we do, that in no way imposes any limitations on property rights of those owners. If they decide to change, they would go to the design committee just as they do now, no change. And if they change it significantly, the worst and only thing that can happen basically is they get delisted, maybe lose some cachet for the property, but that's their choice, their right. Nothing's changed in that regard.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Yeah, if you go online and read through the website stuff, The only thing is if you're going to come in and demolish it, in other words, just level it, whatever, then you're going to have the California Environmental Quality Act review to go through. You're going to have to do that, and we're the only state that really has that, so you'll have to do that. If the building is about 45 years old. And that would be through the county, I believe. Everything, all your building permits go to the county? Yeah, that'd be the county. Yes?
I'm not sure I understand what you said about the tax consequences of this. You said that if it's a commercial property, there's a tax break. If it's in this listing, what if it's a residential property? And did I understand that right?
Yeah, let me explain that a little bit because, and again, we have another great length of FAQs as well on that. If you have a commercial property and it has to be listed on the National Register, it has to be listed on the National Register before you start any process. You can't spend money, then get it listed, and then take credit for that money. I mean, if it's a commercial property, which means a rental primarily on it, it's no good for just your residents. If you want to put a new roof on, too bad. That's one criteria. The second criteria, which is more imposing, that it's hard for some people to come up to that threshold, is that you have to spend 100% of basis, which means if you've got the lot, you've got the house, and you take the lot away, whatever that value is, whatever the value of your house is, or building or whatever, you have to spend 100% basis. So let's say the two are tied together, $2 million, that's $1 million, you got $1 million left. You got to spend $1 million on that, plus a penny. You spend $1 million on that before you can take your 20% tax rates. So it's not going to really work much well for retail. Okay? I don't think you're going to spend that. But it does do well for downtown urban properties where you've got to do seismic retrofit, upgrades and everything else, and you've got pretty much an empty building where the land value is usually more than the building itself anyway, for sure. And that's what the whole program initiated. We do, though, have the Mills Act tax, which is once you're on the local register, doesn't even have to be the state or national register. If you have a local register, like a county register, and you get on that, then you have a tax break on that. And that depends upon how much taxes you're paying, whether you're here before Prop 13 and all this sort of stuff. And there's a sliding scale. It can go anywhere from 5% up to about 45% tax break on your taxes. And there are certain things you have to do for that.
The Mills Act that you just mentioned, is that a state of California act?
That's correct. That was by Senator, not John Mills, someone John Mills? Okay, yeah. He wrote the book, The House is Divided, Jesse Unruh and Willie Brown. And you'll see what specialties they're in. Or Cynthia House. Cynthia House is the person that Pam worked through on the nomination of the condominium.
Could you repeat the website one more time? We just changed tapes, so we're good.
PARK.ca.gov.
I won't ask again.
Can't wait to see that. Okay, any other questions? All right, well, thanks for your patience. It's always a pleasure to be here.
I hope you stay for the reception, and we forgot to mention the condominium one, bronze plaque, is up here leaning against the wall for those of you who are interested in seeing it. It's going to go on the wall of condominium one. And the maps and indexes are for sale.
Yeah.